We're here today to talk about, we're hiring the right people, why performance is still a problem. I'm joined by the lovely Derek and Laura, so I'll let them introduce yourselves. Laura, you're first on my screen. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, hi everyone. So thrilled to be here. My name's Laura Overton. I work in learning and have done for the whole of my career. I'm the author of the L&D Leader, but I think most people know me for the research that I did for over 20 years into high-performing learning teams. So super interested in hearing from you today in the chat as well, so that we can address this issue once and for all. And Derek, I know you're going to help.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm Derek Bruce. I am the Chief Learning Officer at Easygenerator as well. But prior to my 6 months at EG, I spent many years doing a head of L&D roles, head of leadership development, and also a HR business partner role for my sins as well. So very much in tune to some of the roles I see in the chat as well.
Okay, nice. And then I guess before I hand over the conversation, I can say a few sentences about why we're here today. I'm really excited to hear what you both have to share from experience. But why we thought this topic was pressing is that most organizations today do have a skills gap. The WEF puts it at 39% of workers need a new core skill by 2030, which doesn't leave us much time. And the question that most L&D teams are wrestling with right now is whether or not they should be doing something about it. So it's whether what they're actually doing is working. Are people building the skill that drives change? Is it going to help when it comes to change how they're doing their jobs? Or are they doing more of a checkbox exercise, just completing tasks that look good in a report, but it's not really having impact when we look at the day-to-day? So this is what we want to dig into. I'm going to take more of a backseat today. We are going to have a conversation, so please do make use out of the chat. Not so much the theory of skills-based learning, but the reality of it. So Laura, I'll hand over to yourself.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And, you know, I think what would be great before we even start is to actually look at your reality. You know, we've made an assumption that from the data that many organizations are struggling to keep up. You mentioned, Aisling, about the World Economic Forum, but the half-life of skills seems to be going down by the hour. The relevance of skills seems to be going down by the hour as well. It seems like this isn't something we're measuring in years anymore. This is very fast and immediate. And I'd love to know in the chat, we as learning professionals or as talent professionals, you know, we want to give our organization, individuals, our teams the best opportunities we can. But at the same time, we're still year on year saying that actually performance isn't there, that skills gap, actually, that you were talking about before, isn't there? So love to know from you what you think might be keeping us stuck. It's from your own experience, would be great, from experience in the past that you've had, if everything's going smoothly now. But, you know, we're here because the session was about getting unstuck. So we're assuming that some people are finding some stickiness out there and love to hear your perspectives. Please use the chat because your insights are so powerful for us and really help us move us through. But Derek, have you been stuck in this, or have you just, do you find it just easy, plain sailing?
Yeah, I mean, I think while obviously there's an idea that a lot of stuff we do is amazing, I think I've struggled as well in terms of a whole transition from program to performance, because I think sometimes the programs are either not quick enough, or also programs aren't actually linked in what the business needs sometimes. And I think we as L&D, we sometimes have this amazing idea, something which is new and shiny, really cool, and we put it into place. And then the people who get it are like, we needed this a year ago. So that's one of the experiences I've had where sometimes the speed of delivery is what slows down, and actually then means the performance isn't where it needs to be.
Yeah, No, it's really interesting. I love, Brian, that you came straight in there with buy-in from senior leaders. It's amazing, isn't it, Brian,
Yeah.
that you know what, the senior leaders can say we can't get the right skills in the right place, and yet at the same time aren't dedicating to building their own. So I think that I see that in my data worldwide. So that's really, really interesting there. And Jesse, you're talking there about, and Andre, also about communications and support. You know, are the right people involved, need to be involved? Do they know that they need to be involved? And that comms thing, I guess, is also coming through for you, Virginia, there as well. I think, Barbara, you're picking up on the fact that this is a holistic issue that we're dealing with, isn't it? It's a systemic issue. It's not just picking on skills and our performance, but, you know, how we adopt new technologies, how we adjust our product offerings to our clients, how we shift service offerings to client expectations. These are all things that are really making a difference there. Shelby, I think that's really interesting. You talk about low learner engagement. I think that's often been a challenge, and yet individuals are hungry for wanting progression, aren't they? For wanting their jobs to be able to move forward. You know, what are you seeing in here, Derek, as well in this chat too?
I think the learner progression thing, I think, is an interesting one, because there's a lot of content available from everywhere now. And I think sometimes we also need to be aware that as L&D professionals, if somebody wants something when they want it, they can probably find it. And our role may not always be to create awesome content, but to make sure if somebody wants something or needs something, they can find the right content. So I think that's also a slight evolution of, if we look back at what we were doing 10 or 15 years ago and making stuff, we're almost facilitating learning, education and skills now. And I think that engagement piece, people, if they are engaged to fill a gap or pain point they have, they will learn. But we need to make sure that that link between the content or what they need to do and the gap is very, very, very close.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and I think Pritesh has really picked up on that point as well, about programs being designed as an isolated event rather than closing that gap in with performance as well. So there's a real mix of perspectives here that are impacting both the environment that we're working in, you know, that speed of change, the necessity of that, and also this sense of needing to be ready. And it struck me, I saw some interesting research from PricewaterhouseCoopers with individuals themselves rather than with their bosses and the managers, saying that actually they want to be in the right place at the right time. So there is a readiness for individuals to want to have skills, and yet there isn't always that engagement with the initiatives that we provide them under the guise of giving them skills. So you know, I think this is skills challenges is a challenge that impacts many of us in HR. With L&D, we feel very passionate about that because we think it's our job to help people grow and change and be better. But, you know, we've got people recruiting, we've got people in talent management, we've got people in leadership, you know, and I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that there may be some really good people already in our room, already in our organizations, and if performance is still the problem, it probably isn't about have we hired the right people, which is maybe, to your point, Brian, the bigger priority for business leaders, but it's actually, have we got the right conditions for them to be performing? And Derek, I think, you know, you're starting to open us up into that. And I can assure you that the data is absolutely behind you in terms of those organizations that are able to close the gap. We can really see that they're looking beyond the programs and who else they work with. And I think co-creating value back into the organization is really important. So there's a bit of a tennis theme here because, you know, in terms of the court that we're playing on today, because I am a Wimbledon girl, I have avoided the crowds in Wimbledon right now, but I bought the tennis here for you today. And, you know, in terms of some of the things that we want to think about in terms of improving performance, you think of those really high-powered people on the pitch, winning those points, winning those games. I'm not a tennis fan, you can actually tell, but I do like the analogy. And you know, some of the theory behind what we wanted to share with you today comes from, as I said before, 20 years of my research. And what I've been always interested in is this axis on the right hand side, which is about the value we bring back to the business. Are we bringing back value that's linked to learning, you know, efficiencies, more people through more courses, more for less, or are we bringing back value that the business leaders that we're interested in are talking about? Performance, culture, the speed of rollout, time to competence, the ability to do the job, ability to adapt quickly, those business goals. And what I've found over the years is that the majority of us are in that more transactional and performing L&D space, that sense of being producers of brilliant programs, increasingly brilliant experiences. We're lining up more with the needs of the organization. But ultimately, those that were delivering high performance in businesses were those that had shifted from perhaps thinking of themselves as learning professionals, as producers, enforcers, compliance, through to becoming enablers and collaborators. So, Derek, to your point, that data absolutely backs up what it is that you're saying, that those high performing teams are letting go of their identity as producers to say, how do I step into that role to equip the organization to learn for itself? And yes, that sometimes involves looking at courses, and that ultimately that involves a massive pivot point of change, you know, of letting go and shifting how we see ourselves as learning professionals in that space. And that's really what I wanted to look at today, is to be able to think about, because I can share with you models. Okay, I can share with you data, I can share with you models, I can share with you technologies. I've been studying all of them for the last 20 years. And yet with all of these models, all of these tools, all of these technologies, still only 10% of us have shifted into this enabler role. So at some point I was honest, I thought, actually, I was even looking at this towards maturity model that I had created from 15 years of data. I thought, you know, having a model, seeing this, nodding away, does not close the gap. So, you know, you might be holding on to some really important design features, models, ideas that you've used, but it doesn't necessarily close the gap. And what I looked at instead was, what are the principles behind high performing learning teams? Not what models do they choose, you know, where were they at, but what were the principles that they were applying to their thinking and their actions in their organization that actually all of us could try, rather than just leaving it to the high performers. Because Derek, I know you've followed my work for a while, but those high performing teams, they weren't the ones with the highest budget, they weren't the ones with the best tech stack, they weren't the ones with the biggest teams, but they were ones who were constantly reviewing this performance loop. They're constantly tuning in to what's actually happening in their business, constantly thinking not only about aligning to business, but connecting to the individuals and grounding themselves in what was actually going on in their organization, their culture, their world of work. And when it came down to responding to what they were seeing, they were choosing from a basis of not what have I done in the past, or what does my boss want from me, but, you know, what does learning science say to apply to the problem that we've uncovered? You know, how do we enable learning in that environment? And sometimes, yes, that's courses. And how do we work with others who share the same common problem to really ensure that we close performance? But they don't stop it there either. The improving in this performance loop is all about continuing, not at the end of a program, but continually monitoring what's important to the organization, sharing what they're finding with other people, and adapting continually their process. And this looks so familiar to all of us because it's based out of the data of our great practices of the past. But it is not common practice. Knowing something isn't necessarily common practice. Before I move on, Derek, is there anything kind of like that jumps out? I know when I shared this with you, you were like, you know, this kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that jump out. I think one, when I spent some time working in benevolence for a Dutch bank, we were we kind of evolved from a traditional HR operating model to an agile model, where all the things we did became products. So leadership development was a product, performance management was a product, reward was a product. It wasn't a individual intervention. And each product team had an L&D person, a tech person, a marketing comms person, and a business person. And it allowed a lot of the stuff you were saying to happen because you had the right people in the room. And it also then moved us away as L&D to looking at things for interventions and looking at things as in, if we're bringing this individual product to market, who are the customers? What do they need? What issue is it resolving? What's the pain points? How do we make sure it continually evolves and iterates? And I think this loop is something which is a principle, is something which, even under the concept of performance consultant, which I think again was a very, very common terminology a few years ago, this is a brilliant, simple way for us to keep answers to questions. Am I doing this or am I not doing this? I think as L&D professionals.
Absolutely. And some of the points in the chat were flagging out that Abika was flagging that many of our existing programs are checking the box, that enforcer role that we saw earlier, and not impacting the daily work. And I think you've got really flagged it here. What this is doing is saying, how do we maybe shift our perception of what we do from being program producers to what you were describing, Derek, there as being helping others to be equipped and ready, helping others to do their daily work and to be ready for the work that they're going to need to do in the future, even when we don't know what that work is. And it's these principles that really allow us to potentially do that. So I'd love to see in the chat any observations that you have, if you recognize this, any challenge, any questions that you've got for us as well, because we want to share with you a case study that came out of our L&D Leader book as we were exploring what does this mean, for the way that we build skills, the way that we build adaptability in our organization. And I had an opportunity together with Michelle Ockers to interview Lisa Christensen from McKinsey. Now, you could say that McKinsey have got the biggest budget in the world. They may not be relevant to what I'm doing, but I want to tell you their story because it was so interesting, because the world had shifted during COVID for McKinsey consultants. Typically a young person in the organization, someone coming up through the ranks, they would be going out with customer visits. They would be there with senior people. They would be in coffee shops. They would be in airports. They would be continually talking and adapting and learning from each other. How did that meeting go? What do you think we could improve? It was a natural way of life that COVID just cut off. And what they found out was that this was really turning up in the data that they were exploring. It's turning up in the data about people being reluctant to give feedback anymore because they were just, or to receive feedback because they were just not used to it, stuck in their desks and in their Zoom calls. And yet that feedback loop had already been proven within McKinsey as being a vital aspect of their culture of being an adaptable and focused organization. And when that's disrupted, it starts to turn up in performance behavior. It starts to turn up in leadership observations. And so Lisa and the team started to delve into that data. And what they found out there was that this wasn't just a skill. You wouldn't say, okay, let's do a feedback course. Let's teach people how to give and return. They said, actually, the problem was when they really looked at the tuning in to the individuals, it was a problem of, I was struggling to feel confident enough to receive it without feeling defensive. It was an emotional barrier rather than a knowledge barrier of receiving feedback. And so they looked at responding, they applied some really strong behavioral science, learning science, and said, this does not need a course delivered from central. What this needs is a process of change, continual change within the organization. And Receive to Grow was a really simple 4-week email campaign that was hosted by local leaders and used to encourage individuals to be able to move forward. And it completely shifted the culture of feedback within the organization. So it's a story I want to kind of come back to because it isn't about courses. It's about tuning into what's actually needed to shift the behavior. And in this instance, it was actually about a campaign and regular connection with the world of work that they were in. So I wanted to share with you some ideas from the data and also from this story about how Try was implemented there. Before I move on, Derek, you're about to kind of share some insights. And also, I'd love to hear from the chat if you've seen this case study before, or if anything resonates with you, if you've done anything similar in your own organization.
I think I was just nodding because I think one of the things L&D has got stuck, and I think we're almost at this tipping point now as a industry function, whatever the word is, where we're keen to move away from this order taking persona and keen to move towards this performance consulting, almost internal consultant kind of role. And yet the challenge we have is how we're perceived. So I was chuckling because obviously looking at Perceive to Grow, that isn't a training course. That's almost like a way of actually addressing a gap with a very, very specific need, which addresses a gap, and that's it. It's not a 3-hour e-learning course, which could be amazing, but no one actually then benefits from. So that's why I was kind of smiling. It's just we need to also be conscious of the roles we play and how we play them as L&D as well. That's what sprung to mind.
Yeah, I think it's really important observation there. And actually, you know, when we think about how we establish the performance loop, I'm going to share with you a few thoughts and ideas in this session today. And then I'd love you to give me any examples that you have in your own practice as well. But, you know, how we establish that kind of continual loop. And the importance about the Try principles is it's a continual loop of continually navigating that world that you've described so eloquently earlier in the chat, of constant change, of brick walls, of people actually kind of saying, no more, no further. And I'm too busy with my own world of work. And yet at the same time, everything that we do is all interwoven and interlinked. There isn't a simple route through this, but this kind of constant process of tuning in, responding, improving, tuning in, responding, improving. It's not the hard work that you think it might be. And it was really interesting, Pratesh's comments about lack of resources to be able to do this. But it's also, it's a mindset to adopt. And I really want to kind of share with you maybe some of the ways that might help you review that. And please kick back on me in the chat if it's not working with you, or if you've done something different, because this tuning in principle, it's about what works in your organization. It's not what works in McKinsey or what works in Derek's previous examples, but it's what works in your organization that we need to be tuning into. But there are some principles that we can learn. The common shared destination. Now, obviously, everyone who's in Wimbledon at the moment, you know, everyone that, you know, the people who do the strawberries and cream, the ball boys, all of the competitors, all of the coaches, they've got one view in mind, is who the Princess of Wales is going to give the trophy to in 2 weeks' time. And that allows for a kind of teamwork that we kind of come together. And it certainly is something, those high-performing teams were always around about 3 or 4 times more likely to say, we've agreed what needs to be done from the business as a result of this program. Very simple, but many of us don't actually do that. You know, starting with the business priority, even when the business doesn't want to share that priority. There are ways of tuning into that. And certainly at McKinsey, Lisa, what she did was there was a range of data, but there was also a range of people who all cared about this particular issue. The second area is understanding where the individuals are struggling. And I get that completely. To do performance consulting on every individual person, you can't do that. That's too much. But to really start to ask questions about, is this a learning issue, or is this a work environment issue? And as the McKinsey people were starting to dig in, they realized this isn't actually we don't know how to give or receive feedback. It was an emotional challenge of feeling confident to receive feedback, of asking for feedback when they think they might be rejected. It's very easy to sit down with a cup cup of coffee in an airport lounge and have a chat. But when you've got to ring someone up and you've got to ask for something that may or may not be palatable, it's a very different thing. And that they realize that actually that's the challenge. And just talking to the people doing the work, that this concept from Japan, this go to Gemba, spending time, not necessarily protection with all the individuals, but at the workplace, the work front, I think is so, so vital to understand, is this a learning issue or is this a business issue that is there for us? So, that's another aspect of tuning in that McKinsey was doing. And then to the point of, is this a performance problem, a behavior problem that can be shifted, or a workplace design problem? And the really interesting thing about McKinsey is they took part in a skills surge. And basically, they realized that it wasn't just learning and development who were interested in this feedback loop. They had people in performance consulting, they had people in people analytics, people in talent, the senior business leaders. They were all saying this has become a problem for all of us. And so what they did is they worked together with a problem for all of them in that situation. And that meant that it was amplified from all around. It happened to be coordinated, this skill surge, by the CLO, but actually everyone had skin in the game. And it meant that the CLO didn't say, well, if I'm in charge, it must be a training course. It was like, how do we all use our internal expertise around this issue to really make sure it happens? So that's tuning in. Derek, have you got any more examples of where that's kind of worked for you and maybe shifted some of the frustration that we've been reading through in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the nice examples we had when I was at Signify, which is another Dutch company, was we had a load of first level managers who, when we did engagement surveys, and we're talking about their experience as being a manager, we realized the trend of their discourse in terms of being engaged, being comfortable, being confident was lower than other managers. And we realized that we weren't giving them enough support in that transition from employee on a Friday night to manager on a Monday morning. And rather than, again, making a program, developing of L&D and going away and come back as something shiny, we just got a bunch of them from across the different locations, ran focus groups, and actually asked them what they needed. Going back to, I think, your previous slide, it was almost, what is it that's causing the pain point for you in this role? What are the 3 or 4 things where, if you'd had this before you started your job, what would have made it much, much easier? And we then developed not initiatives, but experiences and journeys and reference points and relationships that they could buddy, where they could find learning, or they could attend formal programs, but different ways of addressing it to actually fill those gaps in. But the key thing was, rather than creating a course, we actually had this mindset, which was, if we do something, so what? What's the outcome? What's the so what? And we realized if we went ahead the old way, it would have just been another existing bunch of learning, which wasn't helping the guys in the first place. So actually bringing them close to us, getting them involved to co-create experiences, whether it was learning or whether it was buddying, whether it was mentoring, whatever is needed, allowed us to support them in their roles to be better managers. But it came from them and us partnering and co-creating the way forward, rather than us thinking we knew best. And I think that, looking at the tuning in bit, it is very much around learning is not always the answer in a context of a formal course or an e-learning or even a book. Sometimes it can just be connecting people. It can just be different experiences as well. So I think that's the one thing I remember as we were talking, which was quite an interesting experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you said that, Jessie is also saying the similar thing in the chat as well. When you're asked for something, it's an opportunity to open up a conversation and say, well, why is it that you want this? And, they're asking that so what question, but maybe perhaps Jessie may not have asked it quite so harshly. But I imagine, Jessie, from your comments, that when an initial conversation that opened up with a request, your curiosity, you're tuning in, you're like, is there a better way? What are we trying to achieve here? The emphasis on the we means that we end up with this great opportunity that you had as a personalized campaign. I think that we can sometimes think this is going to be too big for us, but sometimes tuning in is as small as having an opening from a conversation and say, well, what does this mean for the individuals, and what else is going on in your team right now that we need to be aware of? So this kind of principle of tuning in can really unlock tiny opportunities and also massive opportunities to make a difference in the organization. And when they're unlocked, then we can amplify them in that world of work. So love the comments that you're actually sharing here. Mika, good question there. How do you determine whether it's a skill gap or a broken way of working? Tuning in helps, turning up helps, looking around what else is going on in the organization helps. There are some really clever tricks and techniques, the work of Bob Mosher, the 5 moments of need, some really great ways to be able to identify this, and it's the heart of performance consulting. But just for me, in my observation, just being aware that we need to look for it is the best place to start. Derek, have you got any thoughts for me before we?
Yeah, I think the interest, that's a really great question, but it's also if it's a skill or if it's a cultural issue as well. And I think when you then determine if a person had the skill and if they applied the skill, nothing would change, then it's environmental. And that's how I was worked out. So if we give loads of leaders the ability to have great feedback conversations, but then the managers above them are not doing it, then you know there's a challenge because the environment doesn't reinforce them doing it. So why do they do it? And I think that's when you determine whether it's a cultural thing, environmental. And I think our roles, a lot of the time, we're asked to fix stuff which are environmental or structural, not learning. And I think that's where then you've got this persona of L&D not having value because we're not fixing stuff. But there's never going to be, it's almost like playing tennis with baseball bats. Bad example, I'm trying to kind of do the whole women thing, but it kind of highlights that we're never going to be successful because the solution we're going to give is never going to fix the problem. And it goes back down to what you're saying, tuning in is tuning enough to say, actually, this isn't a learning thing. We cannot fix this. And we can talk to people where we think we can support you in a different direction. It's having that bravery as well.
Yeah, and also finding out who else has got that challenge. Because talking to them and say, actually, what do you see? Do you see this as being something about learning, or do you see this as being something else? So there are often people who share the challenge, the skills gap challenge, and having that honest conversation with them as well can really help us. But once we have tuned in a little bit more and understood, maybe we are able to help fix that performance loop, not to deliver a program, but to address the performance loop. And, the R in the TRI principles is about responding. And constantly, what I would say is choose practice over content. Match our response to the performance that's needed rather than the training that has been requested. And the way that we can do this is by really choosing well, looking at the science of how people shift their behavior. For Lisa at McKinsey, they dug into behavioral science because when they realized it was an emotional resistance that they had in that environment, that they needed to look at how do we shift and nudge behavior to make it feel safer for an individual to work in that environment. So Mika, to your point, the McKinsey example wasn't necessarily a skills gap, but it was a way of working. But the L&D still got involved with that because they started to say, actually, let's look at behavioral science. If we use nudges, for example, and send out little short challenges that weren't too tough that it lost people. The science tells us if we challenge people and stretch them too far, we lose them, but just enough for them to think, well, you know what, I'll give that a go. I'll do it. I'll try it. So actually choosing the opportunity to create practice over content and using some of the real good learning science, behavioral, economic science that is out there really makes a difference there. But it's a choice up front. And if all we can do is provide a course, question whether or not that's going to be good enough. Is this the right thing at the right time? So I think that's a choice that we can make in terms of our responding. And then also to this point as well about using the learning science to address the challenge is design what we are doing for doing, not just knowing. You know, they did this 4-weekly campaign, small spaced repetition of ideas to get people to go out. One of the examples McKinsey used, for example, was to say, treat feedback as data. Go and get some data and then map that data. And just that kind of like de-emotionalizing, it's not the right word, but, you know, taking the emotion out of the task that they were asking them to do, but getting them to practice to say, look, you need to get some feedback in order to complete this challenge and get some data. But at the same time, you know, they were using the science to build that practice genuinely into the flow of work. So I think that was a really powerful example of what they were doing. But the other thing, and Joyce, thank you so much for kind of segueing into this. The culture is a massive issue. And often what I've found, particularly with transactional learning and development teams, is that there's a lot of blame culture, like the managers don't engage, the individuals don't engage. But what the high-performing teams did consistently, there are 7 or 8 times more likely than the transactional teams, was to say, actually, we equip the line managers to help their teams apply this learning. And McKinsey did that. In fact, McKinsey went one step further with their Receive to Grow program. They said, this isn't coming from us centrally. We are putting this in the hands of you as local leaders because you're the ones who said this is a challenge. You invite people to take part in the 4-week challenge. You get involved with their process. They could do that because this was a problem that the business leaders had locally. And they couldn't have done it if they said, look, here's an HR thing that we're doing and we want you to get involved with it. That's very different from saying, look, you have got this challenge and we've got a way of helping you address a problem that you're living with on a day-by-day basis. Can we help you to do that? And that flow, that rollout, that surge from the business leaders got an incredible adoption and a real shift in behavior. So they reduced the friction for getting the managers involved and created it as part of their rhythm and routine of getting kind of connection and engagement. What McKinsey does have is a psychological safety culture that they want everyone to continue to grow and to learn. So there's a positive element in that, and the environment that managers create is really important. But there are things that we can do, really practical things, to be able to get managers involved. So, I mean, Derek, any observations through on that one? Because I'd love to have a question to the room as well.
Yeah, the other thing about managers, I think, is not only bring them involved in the context of this, but when we do bigger interventions, simple things like briefing them so they know what we're doing, simple things like involving them in design so they know what we're doing, and simple things such as helping them to help us determine how we measure success. So if my leader's going somewhere to do something or being educated, what do I want to see differently? And I don't think we often ask the question of the manager, but also I don't think we often ask the question of a person who that person reports into when we come down to those kind of experiences. So if I'm going to be a manager taken away to do some amazing experiences around feedback, communication, delegation, performance management, all that kind of stuff, we don't ask the person reporting to them what are they seeing different as well and what they want to see. So I think there's these opportunities where we need to think about the impact of this person with this performance improvement. How we want to see the difference at some point in the future and where we're going to see it, and also involve those people.
Yeah, no, that's such a powerful point. And Giuseppe, to your point about knowledge retention, where people forget and that opportunity to practice breaks down. It would be great to hear from you in the room as well, as we kind of move towards the close of this, is where that opportunity to practice breaks down for you. You know, is it about the scale. We've talked about that quite a lot today. You know, how do we deliver that kind of personalized experience to people at scale? It could be the role of technology, it could be the culture of the organization, but what are some of those kind of opportunities or breakdowns in opportunities to practice for yourselves? You know, Joyce, I really appreciate the fact that you're talking about forget the training if it's not relevant. You know, that relevance is so vital.
100%.
I did some research with 50,000 workers at one stage in my research career over a period of 5 years, from directors through to apprenticeships. And across the board, when I asked them, you know, why do you learn stuff to do your job? You know, it was a general question about how they learned stuff for themselves and what was important to them. Relevance, timely relevance, Joyce. Every single time they say, look, you know, this is what motivates me. I want something that's relevant and timely. I'll get involved from whatever level they were in the organization. And if we don't, it's not relevant, then we're not going to practice either. So I think I really appreciate that perspective. Any other thoughts about where does the opportunity to practice break down? Abigail, thank you. Time to return to the topic and check for learning. You know, Abigail, what McKinsey did in their campaign is they turned the email not only into a nudge, into a piece of content, into a challenge, but also use the email to get people's feedback. What did you do? How did it work? What did you find out? And that insight and that sentiment really shifted the dial in terms of what it was that they were exploring and the feedback that they had. We do depend on managers, Virginia, yeah, absolutely, as coaches as well. But here's a challenge, and Derek, I don't know whether you find this as well. When we ask managers to be coaches, often they feel that they're trying to be an extension to the learning and development team rather than being at the heart of their own job. So I think this is a big challenge for us, is how we're not necessarily always removing the friction, but how do we release people into that? Derek, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I think when you're talking about lots of people who move into managerial leadership roles have moved into those roles because they're awesome at something which wasn't leadership or managerial. They're awesome at finance or sales or marketing or whatever. So even with the most amazing support development, some of them just don't have that nuance. And then saying alongside that, you've got to be a coach, which, talking about Wimbledon, talking about the World Cup, it's a very, very, very difficult thing to do. And so I think also then, given you don't get the consistency if you make managers the only place where you can coach, where you get coaching, because you get different levels of sophistication, different levels of engagement. And I think that's where the opportunity breaks down as well, because I may have a great manager who can do some great coaching and I can practice. You may have a manager who's a complete nightmare. And it's like, oh my God, and he just never listens and he gives you bad feedback. And that lack of consistency, I think, is also a challenge, which then makes me as an employee reluctant to want to practice as well.
Yeah, and then there's an inequity that comes out, a lack of fairness in that process. And please keep your questions coming, because we're coming through to the end. Oh, Virginia, go for it. If a manager can't coach, they shouldn't be a manager. I think that's a powerful statement there. And Virginia, I think our roles are all shifting at the moment. And I think one of the skills gaps that's opening up, what are the essential things that we're going to be needing to do in this new world of work? It's quite powerful. I mean, I think that technology can really make a difference. I would love us to really dig into that right now, Derek, but we can't dig into exactly how the tech works, but maybe there's other opportunities to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I mean, and again, as Easygenerator, we have an amazing part of what we do called Easy Coach, which, if this is kind of really hitting you, this is kind of hitting you home, and like, yeah, when I think about my people, the ability to practice, I can see them struggling. Will join us on the 14th of July, which is actually 2 days before my birthday. I'm running a live demo of Easy Coach. We can actually just see it. You can see how amazing it is. You can get some real life experiences as well. And we've got companies, we've got actually customers from equity trust as well as station casinos, and they'll walk you through how they're using it. And I think there's many ways the whole concept of being coached and using AI to support you can be used now. And one of the many ways is also supporting scale. So if you're around between, well, 12 o'clock ET, that must be 5 o'clock UK time, 6 o'clock European time, pop in and see William, Dejan, and also Krishna as well. But it's an amazing session it's going to be.
I think this is a really interesting conversation to pick up. Derek, I'll give you a completely honest, open perspective on this. Is I am a terrible coachee. When I'm working with a live coach, I am not very good at all, because I always feel as though I have to perform for them, and I always feel a bit of resistance. And then I was introduced to some AI coaching, and it completely changed how I look at that process, because it kind of released me out there. So don't tell anyone that I'm a terrible coachee, because obviously as a learning,
it's not being recorded, it's fine, it's okay.
It's not being recorded, that's good. But I do find that technology, for me personally, releases a freedom in me to have an honest conversation. So I'd be super interested in this one. A key thing in this kind of principles of continually closing the loop isn't just about how we are tuning in, how we're responding in the right way with the right people, connecting, engaging, but at each stage, how close are we getting to that destination? How close are we getting to the, what are the scores? Where are we at in the game? Do I need to change tactics? Do I need to change racket? Do I need to change whatever drink I'm drinking on the side of the court? It's measuring what matters to the performance in the game that is important here. And part of this kind of coaching process, part of the way that we're in engagement with others is really vital. The McKinsey, they had so many different data sets that had nothing to do with learning and development, but everything to do with company performance and the way that people were connecting and engaging. That data was being used. The individual comments on how they were receiving feedback, they were all gathered. So it's not necessarily what's easy, what we can do through our learning management systems, but actually what matters to the performance and what matters to the success criteria of the teams that we're working with. So those busy managers, if they're being measured on a particular aspect of work, checking back in with them, how is that going? What else might we change? Because that is part of sharing the data that's relevant to that common goal, that ultimate trophy that we're going for all together, means that we're all tracking our progress. And someone say, well, actually, it might be something else in that, or maybe we could work differently together. But talking the language of what matters to the teams that we're supporting is really vital, because it gives us a way of saying, okay, if we're moving together, we can make a plan together to be able to connect to those common goals, common dashboards. What do people need in their dashboards? Not what can we deliver for them, but what do they need? And some of the tools and the technologies and AI, the way it helps us to analyze some of this insight that's coming back from Slack chat rooms, from conversations with customers. All of these things allow us to check in regularly. Are we getting closer to the goal that we've agreed with you about feedback, about customer service? It's not rocket science, but it's the stuff that actually makes a difference. And are we using those signals that we're picking up to change direction? I'm very conscious that we're kind of closing down. So I'm going to end with the story of McKinsey. McKinsey, they put out this program, but they used the signals. It was being adopted, it was being connected, but they decided, rather than to have it as a catalog program, it's now absorbed. The Receive to Grow is now absorbed into other initiatives that they are doing, rather than having it as a standalone initiative. They were willing to let go. They were willing to say, actually, this is becoming a way of the rhythm and routine of the way that we do work, the way we give and receive feedback. And it's something that needs to, as you said in the chat room, to be accelerated, but at the same time, it's also something that we don't have to persist on a program all the way through when it's done its job. So that's really the kind of performance loop checklist that I want to leave with you today. These principles are tuning in, responding, improving continually through the conversations we have, through the way that we look at data. That's what closes the performance loop. It's not just another little 3-thing triangle. This has come out of 20 years of data. And you will recognize it. If you go to any conference and someone says, I've closed the gap, you will see this in action. Not once. I decided then, I moved along linearly, I measured return on investment at the end. Constant iterations, loops, because their goal that they had in mind was the most important priority, not for the learning team, but for the whole organization. So this is a performance loop checklist. We're going to leave this through with you. We want you to be able to use it, but we also want to use the remainder of this time to say, yes, you'll get copies of the webinars and slides, but only, Joyce, if you promise to put this list on your wall to help nudge you through as well. But no, but seriously, you'll get copies of this. But how can we help you? What areas have we not covered in this session that you want to have more insight from? Because trust us, Derek's got the experience, I've got the data, and we'd love to open the floor to you.
And I think while you're typing madly with your keyboards and your fingers, I think one kind of caveat about the role of managers, as at a session last week where we had power leaders who are people who are really, really good in their role of CLOs, etc., in the UK. And we spent about 2 hours talking about the different expectations on leaders and managers now. And I think it's right. Managers should be coaches, but also they should be therapists. They should be directional. They should be individuals who can allocate tasks. It's a very difficult role. So I think our role as L&D is also to make sure we equip them as well and actually make their role as easy as possible to help people learn, which goes back to the culture and also goes back to the learning culture piece as well. So I think we need to make sure we cut them some slack, because the role of managing people in 2026 with all the nuances is a big role as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, we may have missed something, Aisling, in the chat as it's gone through, but if you've got questions about creating the conditions to help people perform, then we would love to answer them. And also, if there's one thing that's happened or one word from today that you think, actually, I want to take this forward, please share that in the chat as well, so that we can all learn and grow together in the last few minutes of this session together.
I was having a look at the chat, but you were very quick on your feet, Laura, and I believe you got to all the questions. But I'll have a last look. If we did miss anything, you can also nudge us as well.
I've just seen Joyce's put culture, yeah, and I think that is one of the big things, having a organizational learning culture, and it doesn't depend on the size, it depends on the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
My very first study that I did called Linking Learning to Business, one of the things that I noticed was that wasn't that the people who were getting really powerful performance results, they weren't just talking about building a learning culture, they were working with the culture that they already had and used it to amplify learning opportunities. And I think we often think we've got to shift the culture before learning will take place. Learning's already taking place in different ways in your business. So it's how do we explore that? How do we find that? How do we amplify it? How do we fan that into a flame and make it kind of catch in the other parts of the area? So I really appreciate that.
Can I just, as a quick one, I've seen from Abigail, which is examples of things to be tracked. I think that's a really question in terms of a metrics. And there's a phrase I heard in Benevolence called vanity metrics, which are the things which we as L&D love to track. Bums on seats, how many courses we did, happy sheets, blah, blah, blah. And I think that what needs to be tracked is the impact of what we're doing. So if we're doing leadership development, are we tracking, for example, the engagement scores of the people who've been on those leadership development programs and their teams? Are we tracking how long they stay in the organization? Because if they leave because they can't be great leaders in the environment, is it right? What can we do to support that? Are we tracking succession of those leaders to different roles, for example? So it's about tracking the things which impact the organization we work in, rather than tracking the products we've produced. I think that for me is kind of a big nuance around what we track.
Yeah, absolutely. Andre's got a really interesting question here about what's a good way to reach the right people without creating issues in the chain of commands. I really love this, Andre. And one of the things that I've noticed when I've been interviewing people or I've been studying is curiosity. I think it plays a massive part. Not that we want access to win them over, but asking for access to learn more. And often it may have permission to attend your meeting, to explore and to listen and to learn, and to stretch myself as a learning opportunity is a way that some people use, can create opportunities to work with people at different levels in the organization. May not work if you've got a blocker of a manager saying, no, you can't do that. But actually, it's much harder to say, I just want to learn more about this. Is it possible that I could do this as a stretch assignment? Ask if I could join that meeting so I can just understand it more. It would help me better in my job. You never know, you might get a yes. Have you got any thoughts on that one as well?
I've got the opposite thought, which is probably, but my career is based on some of it. It's almost like ask for forgiveness. So sometimes just do stuff and ask for forgiveness later, depending again on your culture, company, etc., etc. But I find sometimes the blockers, yes, the curiosity, and also understanding the person who's blocking it. What's their anxiety about you doing whatever it needs to do? What's driving them blocking you? And I think there's a 5 why question kind of thingy. You go why 5 times. That's a beautiful way of understanding why somebody's stopping you, but also I think there's also a question from Jessie as well about the root cause. The 5 whys in a conversation is a really lovely way of people being kind of driven down to really say what the issue is as well.
But without irritating them. I think this is
obviously the nice subtle kind of
like why
London UK style, I would suggest. Yes.
Yeah, I've just finished recording a podcast with my co-author Michelle Ockers about the seat at the table. And often we don't have that seat at the table that we wanted. And we had a really strong debate, I have to tell you, about how useful it is, because we felt that sometimes a lot of people were struggling to do what they wanted to do because they didn't feel that they had the right visibility with the right people at the right level. But there were others, exactly as you say, Derek, saying, you know what, I'm going to pull up my own chair. I'm going to find my own way of finding my place. I'm going to act above my pay grade. I know that somebody I work with who says, I know this is above my pay grade, but I just went and asked them, and I just went and asked that person. What she was doing, she was pulling all the threads together, like Lisa did in the McKinsey search. She wasn't say actually that, sort of like working with talent isn't mine, and working with recruitment isn't me, working with data analysts in our team isn't me. But she would go out and say, it's above my pay grade, but let me just find out how I can maybe work something together. Asking for permission doesn't always work. Forgiveness sometimes does.
Oh God, yeah, awesome.
Yeah, staying with confidence. I see that brings us up to the hour. I think you got to all the questions. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. So yeah, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank you both so much. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Derek. That was a really honest conversation, really open.